Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Peter Rhymes
with explosion. Boghossian explosion.
Ooh, the Boghossian explosion. Peter Boghossian. He's the former assistant professor at Portland State University, which we will talk about, and founding faculty member at University of Austin, Texas, an advisor for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism Fair, and director of the National Progress Alliance. And we want to start off by talking about his book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide. So, Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So,
I told you off air I'm a fan of Will's, and it's true.
Yes. Well, hopefully by the end it won't just be Will. How about that?
I'm a fan of yours, man.
I'm already a fan of Shamika. She hasn't even said anything.
So I'm the only one that has to win him over. And I started off with Boghossian. Let's see if we can
that's pretty much
nowhere to
right,
go,
yep.
but up from there. So your the book, Impossible Conversations. I guess I want to start simply by why you and James Lindsay wrote the book, and what was the point of trying to help people guide their way through these conversations.
Well, I didn't realize at the time how prescient the book would become, but a lot of my work has focused on not all of it, but most of it is focused on the Socratic method, how to have better conversations, how to communicate across divides, how to think critically. I did work in the prisons on that to help prison inmates desist from criminal behavior, specifically violent behavior. And so this was an extension of that work. If you look at the Socratic, and I've had an app that does it, my publication record, a lot of it is in that, but if you look at it in terms of the Socratic method as being the core, and then it was fleshed out or added flesh to the skeleton, so hostage negotiations, cult exiting, applied epistemology, etc. And we wrote that to give people the tools to have better conversations, specifically across divides.
So what is an impossible conversation?
It's a great question. An impossible conversation is a conversation that people don't think they can have because the moral, religious, political difference is too great between or among the participants. So somebody is, has a position about vaccinations or code, whatever the hot button issue of the day is, and They're so far apart on that, they think that there's just simply an irreconcilable difference. When you hear irreconcilable divorce, two people, you just can't resolve it, and that's overwhelmingly that's just not true. That's unsubstantiated by the data.
Oh, I think I got some interesting things I want to say about that, but I want to get to some of the techniques you talk about, and then see if Will and Shamika want to talk about just the concept of the impossible conversation before we get to how you have those conversations.
Anything you want, go for it, about anything.
They were on mute. I wanted to see if they were coming off, if they had anything they wanted to say first.
No, I think this is a very interesting topic because I think that I have impossible conversations all the time. And so I was listening to your YouTube or one of your YouTube lectures on how to have those conversations. And I was taking notes so that I could learn how to tell women that their primary purpose in life is to serve their man and their children, especially at a certain age, which that can be an impossible conversation. So I took notes so that I could do that more effectively.
How's that been working out for you?
Some of them get a little upset, but I'm okay with that because you also said don't apologize, and I don't.
Yeah, just tell them to calm down, be quiet. It'll work great. It works great for the guys.
That's really. I'm glad you took that from my work. Everybody takes something different from my work. That's a unique spin, so I'm impressed.
Yeah, I don't have much. I mean, I assume we'll go a lot of places in the flow of the conversation. I mean, the one comment I would have about the how to have impossible conversations line would actually be a question. I mean,
Yeah.
so in 2021, I mean, what do you think are some of the impossible conversations people are afraid to have? Because it seems like that Overton window is just consistently shrinking, where you're not
Yeah.
supposed to really discuss COVID, race. So what do you think the big boys in that space are?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I do think the Overton window is shifting, and I think it's shifting in a very short period of time. In fact, Jim and I actually wrote a piece about the Overton window. So you have a bunch of. I'll answer your question directly, but you have people like John McWhorter who basically are saying there are just some people you can't have a conversation with. I'm extraordinarily sympathetic to that, but getting back to Charles's conversation, you go by Charles, yes?
Yep.
Yeah, getting back to Charles's question, an impossible conversation is not a conversation in which someone refuses to talk to you. There's no conversation there. There's no book that you could write or read, or no article to teach you how to talk to somebody who's trying to bash your head in with a hammer, or just walking away or screaming. I mean, that's not. It's if the person actually wants to engage you about something, even if they're not willing to listen or what have you. So within that domain, then I would think conversations about race anything with identity level salience. So trans, I think, tops the category. Anything even remotely critical of Native Americans or Native American culture in particular would fall into that domain. And then I would put race as a distant third to those two, and vaccinations too. I think that's probably that's more common, but I don't think it's as difficult of a conversation.
Wow. Well, I got 2 points to that. One, I'm glad it's important for people who haven't read the book and want to understand the concept that you put that caveat out there, because I know I try some of the things I listen to, some of the points you make, and I'm like, I do those. I don't call it that, but I do that thing. Those things make sense. But then I'm
Right.
like, well, but some people you reach a point, or some people you understand you can't really have a conversation with at all. I mean, it's not just an impossible conversation. It's just, flat out war, let's say, or they won't talk to you, or whatever the case may be. But you're not counting those in that process. So you already say some of this you just have to shave off and just not even count to begin with, right?
But yeah, even in so okay, I don't know if you caught it, but the mistake I just made. So in the context
But
of conversation,
the but.
yeah, you heard that. I made a mistake. As much as I've been doing this, I made a mistake. I should have said and. I should have said it's called yes anding from improv comedy.
Mhm.
Even in those situations, see, and I got to be careful with the however, right? Because if I insert a however, that's a
Another
but,
but.
and then it's negation, and then the defensive posture goes up. But
Right.
even in those situations, it's those conversations can be fruitful because you can still learn. You can still kind of plumb someone's epistemology, if you will, ask them questions about why they believe things. And most people have. I learned this. I wrote my first book about this. This was in my first book from what I learned about the New Atheist. One of the many things I learned in New Atheism is that people will have well-rehearsed defenses for their conclusions, but not for their epistemologies. In other words, not for how they arrived at their conclusions. And so if you ask them why they believe something, they're more than willing to tell you what the evidence is, etc. This is a little bit of a heresy, but the reason that I almost never ask that question anymore is because when you ask someone why they believe something, what they will do is they'll just list off the reasons that they believe something, and then they'll basically hear their own voice and talk themselves into a greater level of confidence than they'll solidify their confidence. And so that makes it particularly difficult to instill doubt in somebody's epistemic structure, someone's belief life.
Right. And then the other thing is, you wrote the book, I'm assuming in either 18 or early 19, because it came out in 19, right? So that
Yeah,
was
yeah,
before wacky 2020, right? So
right.
2020 was a level of crazy we haven't seen in a long time. So I think that, I mean, does that, I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, I believe that your steps still work, of course, but does the percentage of people that you can't have conversations with because they won't listen at all, has that increased, and how much would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, on the first part of what you said, the philosopher Dan Dennett has um, a lovely little expression that I use this as a lodestone for all of my work. and that is abiding significance. And I everything I write, I try to. I don't know if I'm successful in this. I'm writing another book now. I'm desperately trying to finish it. The distractions of life are a little overwhelming, but is the thing. And this is what I would suggest. My advice to young people would be: is the work that you're doing of abiding significance? Is it going to last? Is it going to endure? Is it going to help people endure? Oh, did we lose Charles?
No, I'm here. You can't see me?
No, I can't. Did I? I don't. I
Wow.
didn't do it. All right. Anyway, I can't see you.
I'm here
For
though.
Charles. That's irrelevant. So don't let that bother you one iota.
Look
No.
at me
So
when
I
you're
always
talking to me.
I always ask myself that question: is the thing I'm doing, is the whatever thing I'm working on, is that something of abiding significance? And if the answer is no, it's especially at my age. I'm 55. There's just simply no point to doing it. Oh, and
Wow.
then the second part of your question is the percentage of people. Yeah, I think we really, one of the problems that we face now is we don't want to have those conversations with each other. And I think a lot of the reason for that is, some of it is it's modeled in school. Some of it's a kind of appropriation of leftist ideology, no platforming or other components that are in this suite of factors that go against having a conversation with someone. But by and large, I think people just don't know how to do it. Oh, you're Charles, you're bad. By and large, I think people just they've never been exposed to any of this stuff.
I'm going to let Shamika. Shamika, I want you to give me some examples too, because I want to put this in practical use here in a sense,
Please.
because
Yeah.
because it makes sense and I agree with it 100%. But then I still kind of like you mentioned McWhorter earlier. I still just have a tinkling, just a little thing in my back of my mind saying that use it where you can. But some of these people, they'll say they will engage. I'm not even talking about the people who will cut you off, but then, they put these walls up or they deflect and these things. And you obviously have these things that you know this is going to happen, so this is what you do. But I'm saying I get to the point sometimes, like you say, I'm like, but is it worth it? Because my approach has always been to try to reach people who are in the center left, center right, who, because I don't know, you don't know me as well, so you like Shamika and Will. I'm the last on the train here. So, but my approach has always
You're
been,
inching up, Charles. You're inching up.
it's good. Is that the culture's an issue? So, a lot of people would make everything about politics. I was like, I don't want to talk about politics. Let's talk about what we can do to change X, Y, and Z, solutions in the culture. And so, in that, I mean, if somebody disagrees with me, I will engage by,
Right.
no issues
Okay.
at all. But if I
So
know that
we got two
they
things.
have this agenda, it's baked in, and I'm just trying to beat you over the head with it. It's not that I'm afraid of having the conversation. It's like what you said. Is it worth the time when there's these many
Okay.
millions of people who are willing to speak? So I don't know when. So I'm going to give, and I'm sure Shamika can give another of an example of one of these topics you put on the board, like you talked about race. Well, no, actually, you said the trans thing is number one. So if
Yeah.
someone is saying, it's bleeding out, as you know. So it could be in a work setting. So what you think, what you post on Twitter doesn't matter so much to me, or what you think about your friends or what you do in your life. But when you're saying, all right, boys and girls at work, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to change everything that's happening in the business that we work in, and it doesn't work because of race or because of gender or because of some other thing, and it doesn't make sense. So now you want to talk about it, but they're just so, like you say, they have their talking points as to why they believe this. Well, I just think we need more blacks here, right? And say, but why? I obviously, as a black man, I'm not against that. I just don't understand why you think the
Right.
overriding issue for the company's future success is to hire blacks, right? So you go through these motions. At the end, they're just like, well, I just think you're wrong, right? So how would you use these points that you have in the book to have that conversation to say why we should do what's best for the company and the employee without just throwing out the bathwater and saying hire the black, hire the woman, hire the trans.
Yeah. Okay. So the first part of what you said, the most important thing, I think this is in chapter 2, right after the brief introduction and how to have impossible conversations, is why are you in the conversation? Like, what do you want to get out of it?
Hmm.
And it's really helpful to clarify why you're in the conversation. Now, you can change that over time, but most people don't articulate that to themselves. I mean, are you in the conversation to win, which we don't recommend? Are you in it to see if you can make a new friend or to try to understand someone's position, which is the philosopher Jürgen Habermas? Or are why, once you figure out your goals, it's much easier to navigate what you want out of the conversation. I've taught for decades, and one of the things that I learned is that people don't ask questions necessarily because they want to know the answer. Maybe they want them to know that they're the smartest person, that they're paying attention, or maybe they're attracted to a woman or a man next to them, and so they ask. I mean, there could be any one of a number of reasons why people ask a question. So
Right.
when you go into these conversations, it's really important to ask yourself, what do you want out of it? And then once you figure that out, then you can know what to answer. Does that answer your question, at least in part?
Yeah, in part, I just think that I guess better how to put this to practice makes a lot more sense and seems actually easier to me than when do you invest the time to put it in practice. I understand that you have to
Yeah,
ask yourself what you need to get out of it, but sometimes you
yeah,
feel like you have to, and sometimes you feel pulled into
right.
it, and you
Well, the
right,
book,
so you need to know the difference, I guess.
yeah, the book can't answer that. Why? I mean, that's a personal thing, but you have little things. I gave you one of yes and instead of yes but, and there are
Right,
other things like disconfirmation questions, like, oh, under what would cause you to change your mind?
right.
And one other thing um, is that you said at the end of that, Charles, is, oh, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but something like, oh, I think you're wrong, etc. I would always avoid the I and go and switch to the belief statement. I don't agree with that belief, because
Right.
the other thing is
I think in that in the example though, I was saying that they just reply to you, well, I just think you're wrong. That's what they say to you.
oh, yeah,
Right. They
that's
just
fine if
reply
they
to
do that to you. Yeah,
you. Right.
that's
One
fine, and you always
question,
want to, yeah.
one question that I have here, just listening to this conversation, when you say that the most forbidden thing to discuss is kind of trans ideology, I
I
would
think
say on the
so.
right, the equivalent might be religion. You're talking about race and kind of the modern social construct sense. Do you get the impression that the less practical defense people actually have for something, the more it becomes an impossible conversation? Like, you will not challenge my religious beliefs. That's just something I thought of personally as this went on. But like the trans thing, I really don't hate many people. Something like potential military opponents or something like that aside, and that's not my field. I want everyone to get the mental health care they need and so on. But the idea that there are two human sexes is not especially controversial. I mean, so a lot of these discussions. I mean, there was a trending tweet yesterday on Twitter that said trans girls are indistinguishable from cis girls, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a bigot. And the person who posted this, I think it was the journalist Pat Lockwood, was just muting everyone in the comments that disagreed. And I commented and was like, I don't want to say something like a dick, Pat, but there's a pretty clear difference between boys and girls. And I got shoved
Right.
in the hidden comment file immediately. But it strikes me that the more indefensible something is in practice, not that there are people who feel attached to the characteristics of the other sex or something like that, but that there's no difference between men and women. When people start saying this sort of thing, these are the things that they are least reluctant to change. Do you find that what's sometimes called the religious phenomenon in political science? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I have to push back, Will, if I may. I don't think on the right. Well, if you're talking about Christianity, which I assumed you were, but if we're not, then what I'm about to say changes. But I don't think. Not only do I not think that religion is not difficult, an impossible conversation, I think it's the most possible conversation. I mean, I think it is literally the easiest thing among the three factors that I talked about to talk about. First, because you have First Peter 3:15, the idea that you have to give a defense of your faith. I could put out a tweet tomorrow that I'd like to debate people. I've been, again, as I said, I'm actively involved in the atheist movement, that I'd like to debate people about the existence of God. I'd have 100 people lining up, even in COVID. There'd be no problem at all. They'd
Right.
love to debate me. They'd love to talk. I mean, no, people love to talk about their
Right.
their religion if they're Christians in particular. So I don't think that's even remotely an impossible conversation. That was my first book and my app, Manual for Creating Atheists, and my app Atheist. But I think that the right have other things that they won't talk about or that are impossible conversations. But I don't think religion in the Christian context is one. Okay,
What do you think
so
some of those are? Just
Yeah, I
curious.
was gonna say, give us some of those.
well, when you asked before about the left, I just basically, I mean, I don't have any data for that, and I know Will's a data guy. I just kind of gave you my suspicion, my feeling. I could be totally wrong about that. I guess you could figure it out from survey data. What do I think it is on the right? I think that right now, at this particular moment, it would be things around the mandatory vaccinations.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be alternative treatment modalities for that. And I'm not even. And then I want to talk about this in a minute because I think this is so important, like ivermectin or what have you. And I'm not advocating it. I'm just giving you an example of what I think that would be. I think that the right has other pathologies that are endemic to it that you don't see on the left, but increasingly, even with those, you see identity level salience. I wouldn't say race consciousness, but I would certainly say an unhealthy permeation with racial attitudes.
Yeah, there are actually a couple I could think of on the right, and then because obviously you're the guest, like I want to go back to
Tell me and I'll.
But no, I mean like a couple of those, like one, I think I think first this gets into what an impossible conversation would be, because I think that if I were to challenge trans advocates to a debate, and Charles and I were to promise, we'll fly you out, pay you $1,000, like the usual sort of adult arrangement. We're not going to do this, by the way, for anyone watching. I have much better uses for my money. But I mean, like, if we were to do that, I bet there'd be 15 or 20 people ranging from, Blair White on the right to Charlotte Clymer on the left that would come and talk. But I mean, I think that with both them and a hardcore, not a Jesuit priest or something, but an Evan pastor, I think that the conversation could be had up to a point. And then they would say, I'm not going to agree with the correct thing you're saying, and I'll eventually physically fight you if you keep trying to convince me to do it. So I think that's Charles's question. Like, when do you stop the conversation?
Okay, that's really important what you just said. Okay, that's why you have to ask, and the older I get, the more I realize this is important. You have to ask, in philosophy, it's called the feasibility questions, but my editor or publisher said, don't do that. It's too academic. Disconfirmation questions, like I mentioned one before. Under what conditions would that belief be false? That doesn't invoke a defensive posture in someone, and I think that is the single best question you can ask someone across a divide. Now there are things that have to work up to that, but that's a great question that should come in the front end of the conversation.
Yeah.
So what you said? So give me one or two things that you said, like for someone on the right is an impossible conversation.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Actually, good redirect, because I didn't do that. I just responded to the first thing about religion. Okay, America's a good place. Like, I've had this conversation a bunch of times as devil's advocate, and I'm, I don't think there are a lot of ultimate rights and wrongs in the world. Humans are predatory apes. So I like America. I'm very glad to be living here as opposed to a Banta Congo where my ancestors are from, so on. But I mean, it's very easy to go through a narrative of U.S. history as endless wars. The different white groups, natives, blacks. And I find that, everyone was killing each other. Wars with the sovereign nation of Mexico. This went on to 1910 was the last Indian raid. So it's very easy to present this as sort of a multicolored pastiche of violence and genocide. Right. And whenever I do that with Republican friends, past a certain point, they're just like, no, that's not true. We don't know, but that war with the Indians must have been provoked by them. So America's a good place would be one that there won't be a budge on.
Hold on one second. So right at that point, that's a disconfirmation. That's when you inject a disconfirmation question. Oh, that's really interesting. So what evidence would someone have to show you that would cause you to change your opinion about that? Like, what would that look like? And then I personally, and I'm not saying everyone has to do this, but this works best for my personality. I'll add something like, I'm not saying I have the evidence. I'm just saying, like, what would that look like? Most people, most thoughtful people won't want to be seen as ideologues. So they'll say something to you, well, here's the evidence. Now, there are only three things that someone can say to you when you ask them that question. One, there is no evidence. This is actually a gift. Because if somebody says that to you, the response is then, oh, well, then the belief isn't formulated on the basis of evidence. So you didn't come to that conclusion because you looked at the evidence. And they'll say to you either like, what do you mean? Or yes, I did. And the response to that is, well, if you have a belief, by the very definition of what it means to have a belief that's formed on the basis of evidence, means there could be some other piece of evidence that would come in that would cause you to change your mind. But if you're not willing to change your mind because you think there's no evidence, then your belief wasn't formulated on the basis of evidence. Now, you'd say that more simply, of course, but that's one thing. The other thing that they could do, so they can say no evidence, they can say, I don't know, which is so this is another thing that's really important. Every time someone says, I don't know, we have to create a culture that rewards that. Like, that's a wonderful answer. So people will ask me about vaccinations. I'll always tell them the truth. I'm vaccinated. I'm actually triple vaccinated. But I don't know the first thing about medicine. Like, I'm the least qualified. You shouldn't listen to anything I have to say about that. And, I'll go on interviews, et cetera, and I'll, what do you think about this? And people always push back at me. I'll say, look, I don't know. I just gave you a compliment myself. I just gave you a great answer, right? And we should say, wow, that's great. So because if we don't have that, then we create cultures where people pretend to know things they don't know. Okay. So the third thing that we could do is people could say, oh, okay, well, this is what we would need to show that America is not a great nation and the Indians or what have you. And then they could present the evidence. That's the best situation, because then you could just see if you can match that with the evidence. But way before, Will, you get to that situation, that's why you need to front load those disconfirmation questions. Because if you front load those, you're on the same page with someone in terms of what you're talking about. There's much less likelihood of misunderstanding. I'm telling you, it is like it is once you start injecting this in your conversations, especially if you've done some of the other preliminary work, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's truly amazing how it works.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've read the book. I think we all have, actually. The book's very useful. I think for me, some of these techniques, I went to law school at a pretty good school, so there's a great deal of training, and you would never say verbal manipulation, but how to guide conversations, i.e. how to argue like a lawyer and so on. But no, the book's quite good. I recommend people read it. But I think that for me, really the point I was making about a lot of these left and right-wing conversations is that many of them just stop at the, no, I don't necessarily have probative evidence, or the, what's the other one, I don't know point, and then won't go any further. Like, if I were debating a trans activist and I said, I've actually done this several times, I said, what would make you believe what I'm saying? For example, if we were to do a chromosomal test that could we're not talking about testosterone and all that, but accurately identify any living human as a male or female, would you believe that you are not a woman or something like that? The answer would just be no. Now we're getting into the zone of what I believe. Now we're getting into my lived experience. Lived experience is a very dangerous idea for this, I think, actually, because the response will be, what's the evidence? Well, it's what I know. And I know this absolutely. Christians also do this.
Okay, so we got a lot going on. You just said it. So I want to go back to what you said in the beginning. If someone says, no, I don't have probative evidence, the response to that is, and again, watch how I always end on a question. The response to that is, oh, well, then shouldn't the belief be held with less confidence?
Well, no, because of my lived experience. Obviously, you're arguing very skillfully, and would probably
they don't care is what you're saying.
With any coherent, intelligent person, this actually gets into Charles's question, which is when you stop having these conversations. I think you might have answered it, Peter. When people just start wasting your fucking time. I mean, basically, but with these answers, I know because my God told me. Now, are we going to go play football or not? This is what a lot of conversations are going to end in. I really do think that is the one block to very skilled sort of discursive strategies. Someone just saying, I know because God showed up in my room. Someone told me this once about why they were Catholic. This is a female friend of mine from a Hispanic, basically hood area who used to party a lot. And the last time I saw her was very wholesome. The younger part of the old friend group's 29 now, getting married, living in the suburbs. And I asked her kind of what caused this change. And she was like, Jesus showed up in my room and told me not to be a slut. And it was there's not that much you can really say to that. It's okay, cool, good job. Husband looks like a nice guy. Okay, we're moving on.
But I think you're missing the point there, Will. In that scenario, the point would be why, I guess, at that point, that's not even an impossible conversation at that point, right? It's why are you even having that conversation?
But no, I mean, everyone here, probably especially Peter, is a skilled discussant and debater, two different things. But imagine formulating that into law school format. So what would make you believe less that Jesus showed up in your room and told you to stop being a hoe?
At that point.
I don't know if that's going anywhere.
Those aren't disconfirmation questions, right? So if you want to watch some of these videos who's phenomenal at this, truly next level, I'd recommend Anthony Magnabosco, Magnabosco, and he goes around basically and has not exclusively in the domain of religion, but a lot of them are religion, and Of those, many of them are the mode, if you will, are with Christians because I think he lives in Texas, San Antonio, or I don't know, someplace in Texas, but not Austin. But anyway, so he goes around and he has conversations with real people. They're not actors, and you would be astonished, what people tell him, and you'll see that wouldn't require a disconfirmation question, right? So there are many questions. There are many ways that you can ask questions to do what the Greeks call aporia, to give people a sense of wonder, like, wow, like, and I think that one thing, it didn't come up in the conversation, but the point of that, you had mentioned, Will, strategies or something. The point is not to perplex people, but people often become perplexed when they're asked a question, and you can see them, they usually stop and pause. And one of the things that's key there is that you don't fill that pause, because that's an opportunity for someone to just really think about what you've asked them. But I would recommend Magna Bosco's videos, and then you could say things, well, Jesus, well, that's really interesting. You never negate it. Well, how do you know it was Jesus? How do you know it wasn't a demon trying to convince you it was Jesus? I mean, how do you know what God wants you to do, what he wants you to do? I mean, there are just so many questions that you could ask people. But most of those questions are not metaphysical about the entity, but it's a question about their way they process the knowing of that experience, the knowing of the metaphysic, right? Their epistemological understanding. You're also correct in that.
I mean, I definitely think that's
the move toward
a very
the subjective turn away from objectivity and as people's personal experience as a way to know the world. My prediction to you is, I predicted this years ago, and I'm going to stand by this. Christian evangelists and not necessarily theologians, but guys like upper echelon all the way down to the street preacher, are going to move away from personal lived experience, and they're going to move more toward a more sophisticated apologetic. And I think that the reason for that, this is a little afield from the conversation, but it's related. I think that the reason for that is that personal experiences become so used to demonstrate things that are just clearly false by so many people, or an attempt at demonstration, that I think that you'll see much of Christendom eschew these techniques in favor of the more traditional arguments for the existence of God. But that took us a little afield.
Not really. I mean, I do want to get to some other things, but I want to see what Shamika has to say about.
I do too, Charles. You're going up in my. You're going up in my estimation. I want to hear what she has to say.
To Shamika about any of what you heard, but more, your points on the book and the points that he uses and those type of things, and when to make the debates and when to have these impossible conversations and when not to.
I think the thing that I took away most was, why am I having this conversation? So like earlier today, there was a lady angry because I said, women, if you can't take the heat in the real world, then get back in the kitchen. Yeah. And she was so offended by that. And I was thinking it was a if and then statement, but I knew the only reason why I'm even talking to this woman is because I'm in the tub, I'm relaxing, I don't have anything else to do but to play on my phone. And when I was done, I stopped talking to her because it was like a wasted, like I felt like it was a waste. Like I didn't want to put any more time into that. I said what I said and I meant it. If you can't take the heat in the real world, get back in the kitchen. It's really simple. And so I think that's what I take away from what you said is, why are you having this conversation? Now, I will say I have a friend who is an attorney, so I'm going to actually study these points because he likes to argue just because. And so I want to be able to, have these points down and be ready the next time he wants to argue about something silly, just, so maybe I can win.
Awesome.
You're not supposed to try to win. Don't give her that, Peter. She's not supposed to try to win.
I'm not. That's not the right reason. I do know that. But once I study his stuff a little more, then that desire to want to win will maybe go away. I have a question, though. You mentioned the atheist movement, and I've never heard anybody refer to it as a movement. So I wanted to hear more about that.
Sure. So it was so it's really the new atheist movement, and the different people have different concept, how they think about the difference between new atheism and atheism. But new atheism is a little more like rah rah, out to get you. faith is a delusion, don't believe. Whereas old atheism in general is more, there's not enough evidence to believe this, you shouldn't believe it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's also more of a kind of an organized movement, and I was integrally a part of that. And what I mean by movement were that, there'd be conferences, they'd try to enact more or less secular, so separation of church and state, lawsuits, for example, or they'd write the big four are Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens, and they wrote numerous books about the subject, and they kind of ushered in a phase that made or facilitated people kind of speaking up more forcefully than they had, or being more vocal against not even just organized religion, but belief, deity, and God belief in general.
Right. Yeah. You two mentioned that, and we're kind of around, and I had all these other things, but I didn't want to throw you off. I'll follow up, but you said you wanted to
Anything you
talk
want, man.
about something. Okay.
Anything you want.
But yeah, so I, talk a bit about that. Your first book was a manual of creating atheists. So the difference, like you said there, basically it's like the difference from saying, well, I don't believe, and basically almost like proselytizing, right? Almost saying, why not go out and convince you were even at that point, I think wrote about convincing believers not to believe, in a sense, right?
No, I think that's it's a normal that people would think that because of the provocative title. And it was very bizarre to me. There had been so many books, not only books, Mormons in particular are famous for this, but how to talk someone into a particular faith tradition. Right. But amazingly, nobody had ever written a book about how to talk people out of it. I mean, and I don't know, maybe it was a terrible idea or what have you. And so at the time I thought, geez, maybe no one's interested. That's why no one's written a book in this. Excuse me. But the idea was that it was a way to ask Socratic questions to people. But it's more about epistemology in general, but I framed it in terms of the God debate because that was the hot issue at the time. Mm-hmm. And, one thing that hasn't come up at all in this conversation that's important is the question of scales, which is, Will didn't say this, but, I believe that, I can't remember saying that Jesus visited me and told me not to be promiscuous.
Yes, so, not to be a slut.
Used. Yes. In that context, I would always, not only that context, every communicative context, I always ask somebody who has what I consider to be a firm belief to put their belief on a scale. And I developed this over time, and I learned this in the New Atheist movement. This has been an invaluable technique in my conversations I have particularly with ideologues, not about religion. Say, like, well, how confident are you in that belief? So on a scale from 1 to 10, and most people answer the question. Some people will say, well, I don't like the scale. Say, okay, well, any scale you want, 1 to 7, 1 to 100, whatever scale you want, A to Z. Some people still won't answer it, but the vast majority of people will. And so you do two things with that. I hope Will appreciate this. You ask them the question at the beginning, and then you ask them the question at the end, and then you compare it, right? So then you can see if you were successful in actually instilling doubt. Or if I always ask myself that question as well to see if my belief changed as a result of a conversation. That's the other key to this. One thing that nobody tells you, the secret to this whole thing really isn't necessarily the techniques. It's that you have to be willing to change your beliefs. The degree to which you're willing to change your beliefs in a conversation with somebody is almost directly commensurate with the degree to which they'll be able to change their beliefs. It took me a long time to figure that out, but so when you have a scale, when you invoke a scale like that in your conversation, it really enables you to kind of fix what someone believes. So the example I use in the book is a patriarchy. So I say, well, we live in a patriarchy. Okay, so on a scale from 1 to 10, how much of a patriarchy do we live in? Let's say that Saudi Arabia is a 9. Where are we in the patriarchy scale? Now, if they say a 10, okay, well, they're totally delusional. Now, or they have no idea what Saudi Arabia is. Now, some people say, well, I don't have any idea about Saudi Arabia. I've never been there. That's great. You should always reward people for saying they don't know. So, okay, well, in the 1950s, if the 1950s was a 6 on the patriarchy scale, where are we now? And so you can do so many versatile things if you ask somebody that simple question. Almost everybody will agree if not to put their belief on a scale, but some kind of a Likert scale, like very likely, highly likely, like some kind of, yes, I'm almost positive about this. Maybe they don't want to say a number, but once you have that, you're just the number of things you can do in that conversation just goes wide open.
I love the scale thing. I had that on here, but one of my issues is we can get to, you talk about this a lot and you understand that it's a problem. You point it out to a lot of people, but this wokeness, right?
Yeah.
I don't know which one of the people you come in contact with, but as Shamika can tell you, the people we come in contact with, they're not having any of it. This kid, you would say, all right, I don't know anything about Saudi Arabia. Okay, America, 1950s was 6. What is America today? 8.
Right. Right. So that's just born.
All the people I come in contact with that are in that, fully leftist realm are all, everything's going to be worked today. I know people personally who live their wonderful life and they say they're oppressed.
Yeah, well, if you were to come to Portland, you ask people that question, they'd say 9.5.
Yes, exactly. I mean, let me give an example. I have friends who are upper middle class blacks, and you say, how bad is racism in America today? They're like, it's really bad. It's like, it's permeating everything. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Well, when's the last time you've experienced racism? They don't even realize they're saying it. They think, I don't remember. I don't know, 10 years ago. But you're black. Yeah. And you give them their lived experience, but they can't separate the two. But they'll say, well, all the other blacks are oppressed. I'm not, but all the other blacks are. What about your cousin? What about your sibling? I mean, I know your cousin. Well, what about him? No, he's fine, but everybody else. They just take one more off the pile and say everyone else. I mean, I don't know what percentage of irrational people you get, but I get a Shamika, how high is yours? 96.5%?
You're muted. You're muted.
I'm sorry, Charles. I'm over here thinking to myself, Peter's thing is how to have the hard conversations. And I'm just really feeling how enlightened and encouraged I am right now to actually say the things that I say with more conviction and more belief and to be stronger and to really not even teeter the fence. Like if I think someone is fat, I'm just going to say it.
That's not what he meant. It's not what he meant.
It's a hard conversation. And I feel like this has really just given me the strength and the push that I need to have those hard conversations.
Not to control your fat phobia like you've been doing. This isn't the regulated, controlled Shamika we've seen on TV. Right. This is the real Shamika.
Now we're going to get the real Shamika. Thanks, Peter.
You wasn't expecting that. Book has empowered you.
Yes,
right. She was a withering flower before she met you.
You
helped a strong black woman bloom. That's all any of us can hope for in life.
That's amazing. That's crossed that off. That was my top. That was on my bucket list, and I didn't even know it.
But that's the only thing I really want to say about the wokeness. We talk about it a lot, but do you do this a lot, and you're better at it than we are. Do you come in contact with that as often as I would say I do? I won't say it's that much, but it is a lot.
Yeah, I mean it's a cognitive malignancy. It's like a cognitive sickness that's engulfed everywhere. And when I won't mention the name of my former employer, but when I was teaching at a university in Portland, Oregon. The derangement.
A state university.
What state is it? It's a state university. Okay.
A state university. The derangement syndrome was simply unbelievable, and the culture there was. It was just so utterly remarkable that. Well, that's another conversation. But the point of that is once you're out of those, that was really the nucleation point of utter madness. And once you're out of those situations, you definitely see less of it. But in a university setting, particularly in Portland, Oregon, at a state university, it was truly bewildering.
Right.
Any sane, rational person would have thought, "Wow, what." It's like, has some parasitic worm invaded people's brains and causing them to believe utter.
Now you sound like Gad Sad.
The parasitic mind. Yeah, Gad's a friend of mine. Yeah.
Yeah. We got to get him on the podcast. He's been on my radio show though. But I know Will's going to give you some of the questions that were in the pod. But one of the things that he tweeted. But one of the things is that, like, what would you do to fix education?
Oh,
How do we
that's
rebound?
a wonderful question. I'm going to be ruthlessly forthright with you. I don't think education can be fixed. I think we need to destroy and burn the whole thing down. I think we need to build new institutions like the University of Austin, like Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia. The University of Austin is Austin, obviously. I think
Yeah.
we need, and I just read the statistics and the figures on homeschooling yesterday. More people are being homeschooled now. It's exponentially
Yeah, yeah.
rocketed up. And
Mhm.
when you ask people why are you homeschooling, when you look at the data, it's that this is, if anything's been good about the pandemic, not much has been. That's an understatement, but people now know what their children are being taught in the classrooms. So I don't think education should be fixed. I think we need to build and make and strive and work toward institutions that have truth as their North Star. I also think we need to radically reconsider the tenure system.
So how is the university going? I know people when the news came out of the University of Austin, people were kind of immediately like because they are polarized on everything else. That is a great idea, free speech. There, people, those people are crazy. So give us an update in a sense.
Yeah, imagine being against a university that's for free
Right.
speech. And that's
Yeah.
fascinating. And then masquerading, pretending that your university has free speech, and then you're against a university that
Exactly.
prides itself or is constructed around that. It's going well. As far as I know, I'm a founding faculty member with my friend Ayan Hercieli and Kathleen Stock, who's just risen to prominence. Because Shamika, you'd love her because of her work with women's only spaces.
Mhm.
She writes some fascinating stuff, and what people have done to her is really quite shameful. Uh, there is this little inside baseball, but their buildings have been vandalized by Antifa building. And starting a new university is a massive undertaking. It's a massive financial undertaking. So, but as far as I know, it's going great. I'm going to go there in June for the month of June and teach, and I'm extremely excited about it. And again, we can sit around and complain all day, but I think that the key is to build. I do want to build on something Charles said, though. If I could say two things, one of the best things that people could do, this should be the easiest ask in the world. It's the opposite of asking for money, and that is don't give money to your alma mater. Because even the universities that you attended 5 years ago are different. Nevertheless, 10 years ago, they're very different from the universities of today. And the second thing that I would say, if people do want to reform the institutions, which I don't think that I don't think we should put any effort into that, is to show up at meetings. Because often the people who show up at meetings, uh, those are the most extreme people on the far left. And you very rarely have anybody, they control the discourse because they've created a culture of fear. So I'd say show up at the meetings.
Mhm. Will?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of and if you guys want, I can start with some of these questions from Twitter, but just a quick comment on the U Austin thing. I'm going to mute my mic for a second. I'm hearing kind of a hissing noise. It seems to stop.
I am hearing that as well. Yeah, now it stopped.
Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah.
it's my comp or whatever, but I mean, generally, whenever that noise is in the background, if whoever hears it stops for a while. I mean, so
Okay.
anyway, while it's gone, I'll talk. So there's an uncle of mine who's in the military once said, if you're getting a lot of flack, you're seeing a lot of danger, that means you're over the target. And I think that's a pretty accurate description in terms of why there's such a frantic response to conservative or IDW or even Hotep Black attempts to build institutions. Because the people who control the current institutions know that they do. And they know that as soon as how total their control is exposed by a fair competitor, they'll lose all credibility. The New York Times only looks, or MSNBC only looks anywhere close, even Wikipedia today, to the middle of the road if there's nothing else to compare it to. One sentence
Right.
before I get into some questions. But I mean, a good example of this is just even social media search results follow this pattern. So if you search something on Google, like the example I use when I tell this to people is black on white crime, you'll see what looks like a pretty broad range of opinion. It'll go from like the Wall Street Journal over to The Nation. And you might at first assume that this is, in fact, the debate, the discourse in America. If you go to Bing or Dogpile or Yandex or anywhere else and you search the same thing, you'll notice that Google has again censored literally those three categories, all the conservative, IDW, and true radical potential results. you'll see the Federalist, the Hill, Quillette, the Black Star, all that stuff suddenly appear. That had been removed from the original conversation, had been curated. So that's the fear of the University of Austin. That's even the fear of, for example, the Daily Wire, in my opinion. But anyway, so that was more a ramble than a question, although it's dead on point. But in terms of some of these questions, the first question.
Can you pause real quick? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that real quick. So that's the thing. There are conservative colleges like Hillsdale. There are religious colleges like Liberty or Bob Jones or what's the one like George Fox. But this really is not a conservative college. I mean, it does admittedly have kind of an IDW feel, but there's no agenda. There's no loyalty code. Many of these schools, you have to sign pledge statements, for example. But
Right.
It's so far removed from that. It really is just considered, we're going to have an honest exploration. We're going to look at classical text, which I personally think is very important. We're going to have an honest exploration of ideas, and whatever conclusion they come to, I always value pushing back on people. I think it's important for students because that helps them sharpen the saw, as they say. I want to just say one thing that you commented on that I think is so important. And I would like to specifically say this to any young person who's listening to this and they're thinking about, I'm afraid that I'm going to get, that someone's going to say something mean to me if I take a stance. If somebody, you use the phrase, Will, over the target, if that's not happening to you, you're doing something wrong. If you're not receiving any angry or negative feedback. And so what's really important is, particularly if you're younger, is you need to figure out whose voices don't matter. And once you figure that out, if some used to be Twitter egg, if there's some anonymous Twitter egg screaming at you that you're a Nazi or whatever they're screaming at you, why on earth would you listen to that? So let me give you an example. Like if I said something, or if I put out a tweet, and I'll be blunt, and Will, you texted me on my phone, or you called me like, dude, what the fuck? Like, what's going on? Or, Dawkins called me, or somebody I really respect, and they said, what? Okay, so their voices matter, right? So one of the things that we've been robbed of in this culture war is that, and this is exacerbated by social media, is that all of us need feedback for our beliefs. We need to have these conversations. We need to kind of correct our beliefs if they're not wrong. Like nobody wants to be wrong. We all want to figure out what's true and hopefully believe as many true things as we can and as few false things as we can. And the best way to do that is, you engage people and you talk and you consider the disconfirmation questions like, okay, so do I really have enough evidence to justify? And there's a whole process that we go through in our belief life, but I think it's really important that young people in particular need to know that when you're forthright in your speech, if you want good relationships and relationships that matter, you have to be forthright in your speech. Because if you're not, you have to be honest with people. You have to speak openly. Because if you're not only will they not know what you mean, you won't even know what you mean. So you'll formulate a relationship with somebody that's based upon a lie. It's based upon who they think you are, but it's not who you really are. So your relationship will never be authentic. So if you speak honestly and openly and in a forthright manner, yeah, you will get criticized. But if you're not criticized at all, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah, I think that is correct. All right, you guys want to start with the Twitter questions?
Go ahead.
Yeah, and then why don't you just read them and then I'll just kind of answer, and just why don't we do that?
Okay, let's so I've got a couple written down here. The first one was about the University of Austin. The second one, now both of these named names, I'm not going to do that, but this is a COVID question. Why do you think there's so much quote unquote IDW opposition to COVID vaccination? Why did this become a thing with like Claire Lehman fighting everyone online and so on? Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, so I do. It reminds me, I was going to say something that you said before about bridging gaps. I'll come back to it if you want. But Claire Lehman was one of the, is it Lehman or Lehman?
Lehman, maybe. It might be Lehman.
Yeah. She was one of the people in the original article with Barry Weiss, Joe Rogan, Michael Shermer, et cetera, Deborah So, et cetera. So she's, IDW, whatever that means, with Eric and Brett, etc. I don't know. Is there? I mean, I've heard David Fromm put out a tweet about that. I don't know. Is that the case? Actually, that there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, or whatever term one would want to use.
I think so. Just being honest about that. I mean, if you think about anyone that I would associate with the IDW, I was on the list. We were both on the list of like influential IDW social media accounts last year, and like going through that list from kind of the joking ones like Yayo through Brett Weinstein, Joe Rogan. I mean, Peter McCullough, the doc. I mean, yeah, there's been a massive sort of backlash to vaccination. Again, you can have your own opinions here. None of these are, controversial or attack questions, but I'm curious about why that is, given the background in conversational analytics and so on.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's accept by fiat that that's true. Then the question becomes why it's true. I'm not sure it is true, but let's accept by fiat that it's true because, Harris is pro-vaccination. I'm pro-vaccination. And I think that there's also a difference between being pro-vaccination and being vaccine mandate. That's another. So you can be for vaccinations and against vaccine mandate. That's another question entirely. Somebody just put out, I think it was Harris, put out an interesting tweet that the wokeism is such an insidious, nasty, deranged ideology that just corrupts. We haven't mentioned the legitimacy crisis, but it's caused a crisis of legitimacy in our academies, in our venerable institutions, that it could just be something he asserts. I don't even know if he's asserting it, but he mentioned it on Twitter, that you just go to a conspiracy theory from there. I don't think that's true. I had a lunch with Brett. He was here in Portland like a month ago, and we had a very long conversation about it. I don't know enough. I have no medical background whatsoever, so I couldn't possibly tell you the first thing about immunology or virology. I'm the Sergeant Schultz of that stuff. I don't know if that reference was lost, but I know.
I know nothing.
I know nothing about it, and I don't pretend to know things I don't know as a rule. But I don't know why that would be. Certainly, when I've spoken to people who broadly or fall under the umbrella of IDW, that it does seem like many of those people are against mandates, but not vaccines. And then you have the people and I believe Brett is, and I think James Lindsay is too, against the vaccine itself. I know that Brett's against the vaccine for his children. I don't know if he's for children. I don't know if he's against the vaccine period. But I don't know. I would think you'd have to ask them. The short answer is I don't know. I don't even know if it's true.
Before you get to
I know Shermer isn't against it. Shermer's vaccinated. Shermer's wife, I think, is vaccinated. I just talked to him the other day.
Before you get to the next question, Will, can we talk of that? But before you lose the time to finish that, you talked about the legitimacy crisis. Can you talk about that a bit? Because I think, I think we're at a point that every institution is filled. I mean, you could say Hollywood. It's like nobody trusts anything anymore, right?
Totally, 100%. I'm so happy you brought that up. I didn't want to steer the conversation in the direction you want to go, but I think that's one of the most important things that almost no one's talking about. I'm amazed, frankly, nobody's talking about the fiasco in Afghanistan. I'm amazed that very few people are talking about the inflationary cycle that we're obviously entering. So, but bracketing that
because we don't talk about issues anymore, though, because we're everybody's so polarized. I'm just mad. So who cares about what the issue is?
Yeah, what's your pronoun? So, but I think that the larger issue is that we have a crisis of confidence in our institutions. I just read the other day. I mentioned homeschooling, but we also have a crisis of confidence with educational institutions, academic journals. We have a crisis of confidence. I think I read fewer than 15% of the people trust major news outlets, and fewer than 30. Again, within that 15%, trust major newspapers. New York Times, they see their circulation going down. This is maybe we should. This is a whole podcast in and of itself. Right. But I think the ACLU is there. The SPLC. I've been watching. I'm a huge sci-fi fan. I've been watching Star Trek Discovery. I can't. Hollywood has been co-opted.
Oh my God, they're the worst.
Yeah, so we've lost a trust in the system, and the reason we've lost it is because the system is no longer trustworthy, right? So we've built things that we don't trust, and it comes from Habermas's 1973 piece. Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher. It's called legitimation. They don't have legitimacy anymore,
right?
And we just don't trust them anymore. And I think one of the main things we should be working on, we won't work on it, but is how do we build back confidence in our institutions?
Right. And it's all of them. Like you talk about the vaccine, and Will was talking about who's hesitant, who doesn't believe in it, and all these other things. And we've talked about it with different guests in various ways, and Shamika and I talk about this a lot. It just seems weird to me that if the vaccination is working, obviously you assume obviously there's going to be some people, but most people, normal people, don't think there was some sinister plot to put a chip in you, right? They're like there's this crisis that came up. We have a pandemic. We're rushing to try to do what best we can, and we're giving you the
Right.
best information we have at the time. The
Yeah.
problem
And we're,
came
we,
in when it became okay. We need to do this in order to fix this. We can fix it. I'm going to beat the vaccine. I'm going to beat the vaccine. But in order to do it, I mean, beat the pandemic. But we need to vaccinate, and then we need to, and once you get the vaccination, you can go back to normal, right? But then they told people, well, now everything is back open, but you need to wear a mask before you go into that place, just in case you get COVID because you got vaccinated, but you still might get it.
okay.
But then for the people who are unvaccinated, I need you to get vaccinated because if you get vaccinated, then you can be like the rest of us who are, in a mask and cowering in our house. So they kept saying so many things. They're like, well, which thing is true? So you could actually see the legitimacy just drip down as they're talking. And I'm like, I'm not even saying that they're wrong. I'm just saying that they needed a marketing and a PR person because if you're trying to convince people who aren't vaccinated to get vaccinated, the worst way to do it, you said, tell me the worst thing I can do. The worst thing you can do is take vaccinated people and tell them to stay at home. Like Fauci just said, don't go in a restaurant if you're vaccinated. So you don't get on TV and say, put on a mask. Don't put on a
Yeah.
mask when you're outside, and don't go into a
Here's
building even if you're vaccinated. But you unvaccinated people, you should get on board too. That's never
the,
going to
the,
convince them.
the, the amazing thing is that it's just like anything on Twitter or social media, and I think Twitter is overrepresented. I think it's only not even 20% of Americans are on Twitter. So I do think
Right.
that those of us who are on kind of blow that up
Right.
discommensurate to disproportionate to what it should be. But isn't it amazing how everyone's a freaking coronavirus expert now? People with like not even immunology or virology, but no medical background. They're all freaking. Everybody's all of a sudden an expert. And so I do think that part of again, this is another podcast we can do and talk about, but I think it's something that we absolutely have to focus our attention on. This is not an academic issue. This is not an esoteric issue. There's a failure to trust our institutions, and that is going to be the death of us all. Like, you want to know what's going to kick the West? That's going to kick the West.
Yeah. Education. Well, I don't care what you saw on your screen when we were homeschooling. That's not what's happening in school. Shut up. Right? How long are you going to do that? And people are just going to be okay with it.
Well, one of the problems with the legitimacy crisis, and this ties into other things like the replication crisis, obviously, is that it's not just that people trust the institutions less. The institutions are empirically performing worse. I mean,
Correct.
you can look at this entire history of failed major doomsday predictions that are all concentrated in the past 20 to 30 years, really between Club of
100%.
Rome, through Y2K, through Neil Ferguson on COVID. Actually, I'll lead into a question here. My personal theory about this is that 50 years of legacy programs plus affirmative action have produced a lot of dumb and fairly useless elites. That's an honest opinion. I'd like to be able to research that looking at collegiate data. I'll never get to. Never be allowed. But what's your theory about this? Why do the institutions seem to objectively be doing badly? Like, why were the initial coronavirus models? I mean, the Ferguson projection was 2 million dead. You might correct me, but 2 million dead in the USA by like September 2020. Let's give him his argument. Like that's the longest period within which that could have happened. And like scenario A, that was off by 1,650,000 people. Why do the institutions keep making these mistakes? What's your thought, Peter?
That is a very difficult question, and I think it's a domain-specific question, and I think you need to talk about what the institution is. I think you need to talk about somebody. I was just reading some the other day that if you read sociology and anthropology journals for your understanding of reality, it would give you a backward roadmap. You'd have an almost exactly the opposite picture about gender, race, what kind of society we live in. I think it's a combination of factors. I think it's people like people who are like themselves, and they hire people who are like themselves, or they hire people who have similar belief systems. And I think that the big, if I were to say one overarching reason, I would say it's the academy. And for that, I would urge people to watch. It should be out pretty soon. Mike Nayna's film, Nayna, in his YouTube channel. He talks about the roots of the academy. Peterson has also talked about it, but Mike has a meticulous documentation of it in his film. Benjamin Boyce does a little bit, but less the academic angle. But that's the thing. I think that it's the crisis of confidence. It's a crisis of merit. And I think it's the way that those moral impulses are discharged in academic journals. That would be the broad stroke.
And then the big cherry on the top now is progressive racism. The fact that racism is in everything. The CDC, instead of focusing on what they should be focusing on, say, racism is a public health crisis. So when you sprinkle that on top of already, lessening quality of the performance, this is what you get.
Yeah, I actually think Peter had a pretty important point there, just like really one sentence. But I mean, the academy as it's currently constructed does have really serious problems. I mean, in that kind of open discussion, mostly center-right, all the people identify differently space, everyone kind of knows these figures. But I mean, like, if you look at Econ Lab, it's like 95-5 in terms of the ideological breakdown of professors, like leftist, which means Marxist, and liberal versus any type of conservative, libertarian. Mass media, it's 93-7. Although I will say that 93 includes some left-leaning moderates. Let's always be absolutely honest with data. But I mean, when you see these things like 93-7, 95-5, that's part of it. I do think the legacy stuff, the affirmative action stuff, weaker curriculum now that Russia's gone, so on, that plays a role. But just the incredible bias there does mean that almost everyone you see in a lot of environments is going to be the same guy. Like coastal, center left, upper middle class, just down the line, from the New York Times.
The opposite, right? It's the opposite of diversity, and we've done that to we've inflicted that on a generation of people, and their emotional lives and their epistemologies are so brittle now they can't handle anything. So when they even hear an idea, they become jolted by it. So that's, I think that's one of the things that almost nobody talks about. Almost everybody realizes it's a problem, but within that, there's a self-radicalizing element. So, there's an element of fear, so people won't say anything, and there's an element of going to the diversity board. There's an element of people looking over you're afraid you won't be promoted. That's the other thing. The tenure system isn't this objective thing that people think it is. It is. Oh, I think Will, your mic is on.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Let's turn that up.
Yeah, much better. So it's really beholden to whatever the dominant values of the age are, whatever morally fashionable. Like you can't get papers published unless they themselves are morally fashionable. And then the more papers you get published, the more likely it is. But if you go against any of the narratives, you're less likely to be promoted. And then you have a kind of fear, like it cultivates a process of submission. So you do this long enough, you keep your mouth shut, you're a good girl, you're a good boy, and then in 7 years you'll have a cush job for life. But that's the other reason that we need to make sure those institutions collapse, because the system was designed so that people could speak freely. But now we have people who are beholden to the ideology, and they become mouthpieces for the ideology. Philosophy departments are great in that sense. So the gatekeepers of reason and rationality have fallen. I've written 2 pieces for the Philosopher's Magazine about that. The betrayal of, it was, I don't know, if you read the Google Philosopher's Magazine, my stuff is in there. I can't remember the name of the piece.
I want to go back.
Yes, Jamaica, you're always...
Everybody freezes.
I want to go back to something you said about vaccine hesitancy. I want to say, I think the dishonesty for me has been one of the issues. And of course, I'm not a virologist or immunologist, but my major in college was biology. So when I heard mRNA, I go, oh, messenger ribonucleic acid. I remember that. But then when I hear something about it that does not match what I learned, then I start to question, well, why are they lying about it? When someone says something that sounds more familiar with what I learned, opposed to the person saying something that sounds the exact opposite of what I learned that it was, that creates hesitancy for me. So I think one of the reasons why I feel like it's so much is because they just assume no one knows anything, or they're hoping no one knows anything. And for me, if you if you spent a lot of time, or if I spend a lot of time in my life learning something, it's going to be very hard for you to just come along just like that and make me unlearn it or think it's not true, because I had to get grades for this. So I had to know certain things to be able to pass a test. And now you
Uh,
tell me, oh, that's
okay,
not what
this
it is.
okay, this is really important. So all the learning you did and exactly what you said, you went through this process, you worked really hard. Now think about the same thing happening, for example, in gender studies. And where they work really hard, their professors only assign certain articles, they have a very skewed perception, not even a skewed perception, but they have um, they have a view of reality that's just simply not true. But they believe it's true because they believe they have evidence for the belief. And people they respect hold the belief. They're college professors. They've worked hard. They've gotten A's. They know the belief. And then you have the sunk cost fallacy as well. So you have basically, again, a generation of people who have been taught things that are totally propositions about the world, things about the world that are totally untethered to reality. And yet they hold these beliefs with they hold these beliefs not only with great confidence, but they think they're better people because they hold their beliefs. So that's part of the problem in which we now find ourselves.
The people who don't
Is that
have
clear?
children because of the climate.
Yeah, I have two kids that are in the other room, actually. My daughter's trying to keep the dogs quiet. I shouldn't be here right now. There's a little family emergency. I had to come home. So
Oh, right.
Going
But
on my house there. Will,
yeah,
do you want to rapid fire the other questions?
Will, you
Yeah,
go ahead, Will.
we
I,
should be
I
able to
think
get
I'll.
through these in a pretty quick period of time here.
Yeah.
Peter, are you going to start up a podcast called something like Impossible Questions with Boghossian?
No, too busy.
All right.
I knew that answer.
Now, yeah, I think we can all sympathize with it, but probably not to the same extent. All right. I thought this was an interesting, when we all talk about censorship, is there proof that censorship is increasing in kind of American upper middle class life? Is there a way to measure that?
I don't think it is. I don't think censorship is increasing in American middle class life. I would. I so I don't. I don't.
Cancel
I,
culture, people being
yeah,
terminated.
something like that. I don't think that's the word, but do people feel free to express opinions now, uh, in compared to like 10 years ago? Ideally, you'd have someone ask that question 10 or 20 years ago, then you'd have a control. But so you'd have to rely upon people's memory for that, and then you'd get their self-reports. But I don't think that it's. I mean, I guess maybe I'm caught up in the word censorship. I guess there's censorship on Twitter and censorship on Facebook. I just moved, or I just started a Getter account, by the way, just in case. But yeah, I don't think there's censorship, but I do think that there's certainly an atmosphere now where people don't feel comfortable talking. And I've seen the statistics: 75% of people who self-identify as liberals feel that. I think the wording of the question was, if memory serves me correctly, in the last year I've wanted to say something, but I haven't said it for fear of like sanction, or because I felt would feel ostracized, something like that. So you look at those numbers coming out of the classrooms, and those are just astonishing. Those are almost universally above 50%, and they're not just from people on the right.
Right.
They're people, predominantly people on the left. People on the right won't even admit they're on the
Right. And then some of the people are just saying that they think it's okay to tell people that they can't say anything.
right.
Yeah.
No, they're really okay. They think that they're better people because they tell other people not to say anything.
Right.
Yeah, just straight repressive tolerance. I do think there'd be some interesting social science ways to measure this, like using a database like canceled persons or fires, intimate records, and seeing what the number of people involved in, high profile censorship or cancellation cases is each year, something like that. In internal
Yeah,
records, I guess they're not intimate.
yeah. You'd have to operationally define it. I mean, you really have to. That's something you'd really have to parse out. But I mean, it'd be a super interesting study.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true methodologically. Okay, one final just a comment along those lines. Actually, I think the people that are most hurt by quote unquote cancel culture actually are very mildly heterodox liberals. Like on Twitter, this is dramatically what I see, that it's like Patrick Lockwood, the psychologist, or someone like that.
Yeah.
That's just every day having these very polite arguments with people that are like, "You're an evil Nazi." Whereas, I mean, I think the response of me, much less like Glenn Beck, would just be like, get the fuck out of here, black button. You're not going to affect my income stream. We're in a different world. So, I mean, that's something, the people that are probably most worried would be like trad liberals in fields like black studies where this stuff is going on. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I've also heard it referred to as pre-cancelable, like that some people are just, if you're a conservative, you're just pre-cancelable, and liberals don't listen to conservative anyway. So what are they going to do to you? They're not going to do it. Like Greg Gutfeld is an example. I was on his show a couple of weeks ago, or something. That he's a great example. He's a hell of a nice guy too. He's a great example of someone. He's just pre-cancelable. I mean, liberals don't watch that show. They don't even pay enough attention to him to call him a Nazi.
Yeah, pre-cancelable is good. Anti-cancelable would make more sense in a lot of contexts. Though, like if there are a lot, like if there are a lot of non-Fox News watching liberals screaming about Greg Gutfeld and driving viewers to like Fox's second most popular show, that's a great thing for Greg Gutfeld. Like the more people the more blue-haired overweight women screaming at Shamika online, the more her brand grows. Like it's naked girls for successful women that want to get married. Like bring it on would be the attitude. So even kind of the same with me. Like I wrote a book called Hate Crime Hoax. So if people make wild allegations about hate to me, I can just be like, sounds like something that I describe on page 52 of my international bestseller. Whereas if you really are someone working, without doing my full spiel again, but like in one of these departments, anthropology, and you say the wrong thing about like some ancient warrior culture, like it's a wrap. So those are the people you almost feel bad for. All right. Let's actually, because we're obviously Charles normally just going to take the lead, close down the show, but they're really just going to do one or two more of these because it's about 10:30. I'm actually going to end with this question. So someone wrote something I think was really interesting. They said, I think that the modern fight between like wokes and then on the other hand, like alts and the quote unquote IDW has really fucked up this concept of social justice or of justice. Like I want to help poor people. Is there a way to be a social justice activist without buying into modern leftism? And if so, what does Peter think it is? How do you actually help poor, these are my words, but like poor black or Appalachian or immigrant or whatever kids? What do you say?
I think the modern left has pretty much given up its economic basis.
Boom.
They've tried to flatten the economic hierarchy. The old left tried to flatten the economic hierarchy, and the new left tries to flatten the privilege hierarchy, particularly in terms of race. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You'd have to parse that out and drill down on that. So if anyone wants a reference for what my personal vision is, that's a contemporary that kind of stands on the shoulders of giants, I'd say it's Helen Pluckrose's The Last Two Chapters of Cynical Theories. I think it's absolutely, and this was going to ask Charles something about this. With all this talk about equity and with all this talk about race consciousness, etc., what are the names of schools that are primarily, if not exclusively, African American that have been funded in the last 2 years? Mm-hmm. I would like to know what those are. No, or are you just verbal? Is there just verbal posturing? So thinking about it less in terms of race and more in terms of, not even in terms of economics, but just in terms of what I see as a shining city upon a hill, which I see as the American ideal, in which is that all people, independent of their race, their creed, their zip code, they have access to a public education of the first rate. That's a term that comes from John Rawls, the famous American philosopher. They have access to they have equal opportunities for employment, for public office. We know we have a vision of common humanity. We have a vision of everybody has Miranda rights. Everybody has First Amendment rights, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, etc. And so anything that moves us away from that, and particularly with what we're seeing now with instilling a race consciousness in people, that is horrifying, just horrifying. We know from the Enlightenment tradition, we know that all people desire to breathe free. All people yearn to breathe free. We know the Declaration of Independence. We know it's on the Statue of Liberty. We know that I'll throw in a little Star Trek reference from Mirror Mirror. These systems unjust systems are simply not sustainable. And if you believe, as I believe, that moral values are rationally drivable, I think that the course of action is to treat everybody independent of, and not independent of the color of their skin or independent of their sexual orientation, but to treat them as we would treat anybody else. And the more we move toward race consciousness, particularly with the new left, the further we will go from our own human flourishing.
Oh, you're 100% right. I think that not just the list of schools. I want to say it's solutions based, right? Do people really care about what the problem is and fixing it, or are they just patting themselves on the back, or are they focusing on some other agenda? You know, Baccia's book about the class and the media coverage is one good point. But the other thing is to Will's, the way Will asked the question is different, because I don't think they really, I don't remember the tweet, but I think the tweet was like something about, if you could read it again, if you can find it again, Will, I think it said something about social justice versus some other justice. I think to what you just said was beautiful and perfect. The problem is people keep putting these disclaimers on the justice. They don't want justice. They want justice as they define it, right? So it's not just the schools. It's why have we had, so many successful, if we want to look at it by race, why have we had so many successful blacks that don't turn and give a hand, right? So people always say BLM raised all these hundreds of millions of dollars, and where they put it, which is a valid question, but there've been successful people before there was the BLM. What were they doing with the money, right? These schools were failing well before George Floyd
I,
died. What were they
I
doing about
really,
that? So they're
I was
waiting
really,
because
yeah,
they're not trying to fix it. That's the problem.
yeah. And my question was really sincere. With all this money and attention, and everybody's obsessed with equity, name the schools that have actually in poor black areas in which those kids get a good, decent education, which they
Right.
have the same shot as white kids and Indian kids and everybody else. And I've asked probably 200 people that. I still have yet to. Nobody's given me an answer to that question.
And I'll give you the school with no money. I'd be okay with you not giving them money. Just stop teaching them while they're already, I constantly say, while they're reading at sixth grade level and doing math at eighth grade level, when they're in 10th grade, how about you stop teaching them that they're oppressed and teaching them more about, let me give you another chapter of Harriet Tubman. God forbid we just get you up to grade level. I don't even need to
Right.
give them more money. Go down there and mentor them. But they won't even do that.
Yeah, this point that Peter made, though, is actually extremely deep just because it's never brought up. I mean, in terms of what were the specific schools that were helped, Black Lives Matter got, if you believe The Economist, I think the figure's a little lower, but $10.6 billion. This is BLMGF, Black Lives Matter Global Foundation, major article in one of the financial papers, over the past 2 years. What'd they do with it? That's it. I'm actually not going to turn this into a short rant. Just
What they do with it, you all go find out, right?
no, but I mean, like, well, I mean, we actually have decent contacts in the media. I'd be interested. But I mean, like, what happened? What were the schools that got money from the $10.6 billion that went to BLM? That's a really obvious question. It's the first question you'd think a journalist or a scholar would ask. Outside of programs like this, I've never heard it asked. What happened to the $10.6 billion? So there's that,
Thank
as
you
they say.
for asking it. My prediction to you, and I'll stand by this, is that nobody in the center or left of center will ask that question. Nobody will take a look at the schools.
Nope.
Nobody.
Yeah, and it's just I mean it's just a blatant level of ridiculousness. Like the founder of Black Lives Matter, and again, there's a distinction between Black Lives Matter, the meaningless but accurate slogan, and Black Lives Matter Global Foundation, like an incorporated 501c3. Of course, Black Lives Matter. But I mean, the founder of the organized group just bought 3 houses, or maybe it was 4. So they gave her billions of dollars. She bought maybe $10 million worth of property. No one said a word. And this is the climate that exists in mainstream journalism and academia. It's troubling.
Right.
Yeah, and that, to go to Charles's question, that's part of the legitimacy crisis, right? So we don't, there's a total erosion of trust in the media, for example, because the people who are in the media that, almost all of us, I'm certainly not going to say all of us, certainly the mainstream media came up in the K through 12 system. They went to college, they got degrees, but they were all basically indoctrinated by woke madness. And so then the masthead of the New York Times is the same, and the mission statements of these organizations are the same, but the people occupying the positions, for example, of journalists, are not journalists in any traditional sense that we would understand what a journalist is. And so they won't ask those questions because the idea, this is a legitimacy crisis, right? I mean, you're right. It's the most obvious of questions. But even me, if I ask that question because I'm a white cis hetero guy, you can automatically, that's the other problem with identity politics. The truth of an utterance is connected to somebody's immutable characteristics.
They say my truth, but you don't have a truth.
Yeah, right.
You know, and whenever I get a chance to talk about the media, no one talks about this. So I like to put out that the main guy on CNN, forget about the race thing. We must remember he said that a plane was taken by aliens, and he got promoted.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Don Lemon, yes. When the Malaysian flight went, they said maybe it was aliens, and they
I
promoted the
didn't,
guy.
I
So
didn't hear
that's
that.
where we are in the media. I want to end on this, though. I mean, I know we've gone long, but we have to mention this, that the work that you did in the prisons, because
Oh, yeah.
trying to solve the criminal justice problem through critical thinking is pretty impressive. So talk about what you were doing there.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's a good note to end on. So I'm a true believer, if you will, in reason and rationality, and we can derive our moral values. We can figure out, we can reason to why we should be compassionate, why we should be kind. We don't need to pretend anything. We don't need to make anything up. We don't need to fabricate anything at all. And so what I did was I took what I considered to be some really important questions in the history of Western intellectual thought. And then I used the Socratic method and I developed a curriculum. And I went to a local prison here in Portland, Oregon. It's called Columbia River Correctional Institution. And I did my dissertation there. And I the dissertation was about increasing prison inmates' critical thinking and moral reasoning abilities. And so I would run them through this sequence about how to ask good questions, about how to think about issues. And we did a pre and a post test. And it's interesting, in the pre-test, I was wrong basically in my hypothesis, one of my hypotheses, as I thought that people would generate more options to questions when they were asked, but they didn't. They generated, at the end of the intervention, they actually generated fewer options, but less reactive and less violent options. Like one question was like, you walk in and you see your significant other in bed with somebody, what do you do? And the pre-test, it was like, kill them with a shoehorn, punch them out, kind of violence. But in the post-test, it was like, join in, ask her why she's doing that. So the work in the prisons was basically, I took questions from the history of Western intellectual thought, taught prison inmates how to use the Socratic method to ask questions, and help them reflect on their own journey to desistance from crime. And I just love that work. I just love teaching in prisons.
Wow. That's impressive. I got to ask real quick, though, what did you learn from them from doing that for a period of time?
Oh, I can't even, that's a great, I learned so much. I learned what it was to have an unmediated conversation with people who just truly wanted to, they were so grateful. I think one of the reasons I wrote this, actually, I think one of the reasons they were so grateful was because I had a volunteer tag and I didn't have it so they knew that I was there for them, right, and that I wasn't, part of some system. And I think that was part of it. But one of the things I learned from them was that, anybody can everybody has the possibility of self-redemption, right? Everybody has the possibility of taking a step back and really kind of really sincerely thinking about things to figure out better courses of action. The problem is that we just haven't taught people that. And we know from the literature on, it's called programming in prisons, very small amounts of money go very long ways. But we also know when people ask, when they ask to vote in issues, such, almost universally they never voted in. But with Columbia River Correctional Institution at the time, there's 75 to 80% of the people were released back into Multnomah County. I live in Multnomah, Portland is part of Multnomah County. And so we're not funding things when people need basic resources. One of the things I did is I had a resource fair. And in the resource fair, I brought in every people to look at, it was a pre-release facility, so they were going to go back out in the streets. Here's how to access drug and alcohol counseling. Here's how to get condoms. Here's how to put on a condom. Like really basic things that I think people want to lead good lives. We all yearn for the good. We just don't really know how to get there. And with a little bit of help, we can help the most vulnerable people in society. And overwhelmingly, those people want better lives. Overwhelmingly. And so with just a little bit of care, we can help them achieve that better life.
Now, I think that is definitely a good takeaway and a good place to end. He is Peter Boghossian. He is the professor. Well, I guess we're going to go with founding faculty member at the University of Austin, advisor at FAIR, and author of How to Have Impossible Conversations. Peter, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time very much. Thank you for having me on. Thank you. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.